All right, let's dive into one of the most epic escape stories ever told, the crossing of the Red Sea. We're going to walk through Exodus chapter 14, verse by verse, and build a mental movie of exactly how this unbelievable event went down. But first, let's set the stage with this one simple question. How do you escape the inescapable? Because that's the corner Israel is backed into, trapped between the most powerful army in the world and a massive body of water. So our story kicks off with what I like to call the perfect trap. And you need to understand, this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a wrong turn. This was a deliberate, divine setup right from the very beginning. Okay, let's get into it. Verses 1 and 2, God gives Moses a command that sounds, well, insane. He says, I want you to turn back and camp by the sea, basically lead 1,000,000 people into a dead end. But verse 3 tells us why. God says Pharaoh's going to think, aha, they're lost. The wilderness has trapped them. You can just picture Pharaoh getting that report, a slow, wicked smile spreading across his face. And then verse 4 lays out the master plan. I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and I will gain honor over him. This isn't just an escape, you see. It's a trap. And boy, does that bait work. Verse 5, the news hits the palace, the slaves are gone, for good. And Pharaoh just snaps. He screams, what have we done? Then look at verse 6. It says, so he made ready his chariot. This isn't a job for a servant. No. Picture Pharaoh himself, grabbing the reins, his knuckles white, his eyes just burning with pure fury. This is personal. And the army he's putting together, it starts with this number, a number that should absolutely send a chill down your spine. 600. Verse 7 tells us these aren't just any old chariots. They're the choice chariots. Think of them as the special forces, the most high-tech, elite, deadly war machines in the entire Egyptian empire. But the verse doesn't stop there. The second half just expands the scale to something terrifying. It wasn't just the 600 elite units, it was, and all the chariots of Egypt, with captains over every one of them. So imagine you're standing on a hill, and you see this dust cloud on the horizon, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, until you realize it's a river of bronze and iron. The entire military might of the world's only superpower is coming for you. So in verse 8, with God hardening his heart, Pharaoh gives the order, pursue. You can almost feel the ground rumbling with thousands of hooves. And then verse 9 confirms it. The plan worked perfectly. It says, the Egyptians overtook them camping by the sea. And for the Israelites, that's it. The trap snaps shut. They are pinned, with absolutely nowhere to go. And that brings us to the moment of total crisis. This is where, from any human perspective, all hope is completely, 100% lost. Verse 10 puts us right on the ground with them. When Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. Suddenly, that dust cloud has a face. You can see the sunlight glinting off of helmets, the banners snapping in the wind. The text says, they were very afraid and cried out to the Lord. Pure, absolute terror just rips through the camp. But that cry to God turns sour real fast. It becomes a roar of blame aimed right at Moses. Listen to the bitter sarcasm in verse 11. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? Then in verse 12, the panic just boils over. They're screaming at him, saying it would have been better to stay slaves than to die out here. Just think about that. They are saying a life of brutal slavery was better than this moment of terrifying freedom. But in the middle of all this chaos, Moses stands like a rock. In verse 13, he silences the mob with this command. Do not be afraid, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord. Then, in verse 14, he makes one of the most incredible promises in the entire Bible. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. In other words, everyone be quiet, stop panicking, and just watch what God is about to do. This, right here, is the turning point of the whole story, a path through the deep. This is where the laws of physics get put on hold and the real miracle begins. God's voice cuts through all the noise with a command from Moses in verse 15. Tell the Israelites to move on. Move on where? Straight into the water. It's a command that makes no sense, a command that requires total faith. Then, in verse 16, God gives him the 4-step plan for the miracle. Lift your staff, stretch out your hand, and divide the sea. Just a simple sequence of impossible, world-changing action. And here, God pulls back the curtain and shows us the full scope of his plan. In verse 17, he says, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, so they will go in after them. And verse 18 tells us why. And I will gain honor over Pharaoh and all his army. Then the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. See, the very army that's pursuing them is about to become the ultimate proof of God's power. What happens next is just stunning. Verse 19 says the pillar of cloud that was leading Israel moves. It goes to their rear, between them and the Egyptians. And verse 20 describes the effect. To the Egyptians, it's a cloud of total darkness. But to the Israelites, it provides light all night. Picture this supernatural barrier just descending from the sky, a wall of blinding confusion on one side and a warm guiding light on the other, keeping the two camps totally separate. And now, the main event, verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. And then verse 22 gives us that unforgettable image. The Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. So, the Egyptians, blinded by their own arrogance, they charge right in after them. But inside that watery canyon, their greatest weapon becomes their greatest weakness. Verse 24 says the Lord threw the Egyptian army into confusion. And verse 25 tells us how. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. Their perfect, confident charge just grinds to a chaotic, muddy, terrified halt. And now, the climax. Verse 26, God gives the final command. Stretch out your hand over the sea. Moses does it. And in verse 27, the sea returns to its full power. The Egyptians try to run, but it's way too late. Verse 28 gives us the final devastating result. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh. Not one of them survived. Now we shift to the aftermath, to the quiet, stunned moments after the storm as the survivors on the far shore start to realize what they just saw. Verse 29 gives us this incredible contrast. But the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. They are safe. And then verse 30 paints this surreal, powerful picture the next morning. It says, Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. This is it. This is the final, undeniable proof of their freedom. The bodies of their masters washed up by the waves. The threat is gone. For God. And the final verse shows us the complete transformation that took place. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant. That terror they had for Pharaoh, it's been replaced by a new, healthy, reverent fear of God. They saw, and now they finally believe. Which leaves us with this one last crucial question to think about. They saw this incredible miracle, and it made them believe. But when your belief is born from a spectacular sight, what happens when the spectacle is over? What happens when the long, hard journey through the wilderness really begins? What happens next?